the intelligence agencies are driving a lot of the agenda, and there's some real issues with our Western intelligence agencies. The Australian government spent $500 billion on, paying people to stay at home. The biggest wake-up call is I always thought the bureaucracy was nothing more than an arse-covering department. Stop the train we're on and say we're going in the wrong direction.
Individuals that have the courage and bravery to speak for truth, and in the face of judgment, criticism, whatever it may be, they still step up and do what's right.
We do live in a great country. We still have boundless opportunities in this country. We have the world's largest gold reserves in ground.
Senator Rennick, welcome to Breaking the Algorithm.
Good to be here, Andy.
Mate, very good to see you again after all these years, and really excited to chat with you about what you've been doing. And of course, you're running at the moment, you're campaigning, lots of good stuff happening. So thank you for joining me up here on the Gold Coast.
You're more than welcome, Andy. It's good to be here, and thanks for all your support as always. I know we spoke a lot during the COVID crisis, and I'm glad to see you still on your feet.
Yeah, right. Thank you, mate. We'll talk a little bit about that and lots of controversial topics to talk about, which I know you love to get into. So it'll be a whole lot of fun. But mate, let's start from the beginning, because we see you online. I see you in there, and you've got great content online, by the way. I've given you many props about that. Love your message, love what you stand for. But how did everything start for you? Tell me a little bit about where you grew up and a little bit about your background before Senator was attached to the name.
Okay, thanks, Andy. Well, I grew up in a town called Chinchilla. I was born there back in 1970. I spent the first 15 years of my life there. I finished my final 2 years of schooling in Toowoomba. And then I went down to Brisbane where I did a Bachelor of Commerce. I graduated there in 1990 and went back to Dalby, Chinchilla for 3 years where I worked in business practices. My father was a farmer. My mum was a nurse at the Chinchilla Hospital. So I had an upbringing, I guess, on the farm and growing up in a small town, so a very tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone else except everyone's politics. We didn't talk politics in small towns, ironically enough. And then I worked in small business for 3 years, which is really good. Went overseas for what I thought was 2 years, but it ended up being 7 years. So I had almost 6 months backpacking through Africa to get to London, almost 2 years in London where I worked for a couple of companies and, drank lots of beer and did what you do when you go to London in your 20s. Then I got a job based out of Amsterdam for almost 3 years where it was about 8 months based in working out of Amsterdam, 8 months Brazil, 8 months the States. About 8 months Norway and 6 months in a few other countries. Quit that job, went backpacking for almost 2 years around the world. So Turkey, flew down to Turkey for Anzac Day, then over to Pakistan, went across the roof of the World Karakoram Highway out to Old Silk Route through China to Beijing, then back to Trans-Siberian, back through Russia, down Eastern Europe, back into Turkey, then Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and in Israel, and then into Egypt. And I dived at Dahab, I think it was, for 2 weeks in the Red Sea there. Flew back to Spain and Portugal and down to Morocco, Mali and Senegal. Back over to the States, had a couple of months in the States on the eastern states. And Cuba and Mexico. Then flew down to South America, did another loop around there. Back to England, where I got the visas for all the stars, and then flew to Moscow and then travelled home through the Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Iran, Pakistan, Nepal. Then flew from Nepal down to Southeast Asia, had a month surfing in Nias in Indonesia. And then looped Southeast Asia and then back home. So that was 7 years, and then worked at Bank of Queensland for 6 years where I was in Treasury Accounting, Management Accounting and Banking Ops. Then moved to Sydney where I worked for Westfield in Treasury and Tax. Got a Masters of Tax Law while I was at Sydney and a Masters of Finance. Well, I started off finance when I was at BOQ, but finished that off in Sydney as well. And then we had our first son in Sydney, then came back to Brisbane, had a couple of years in some part-time roles before quitting my job, being a stay-at-home dad for a few years while my boys were young, and then tried to become a senator, which I did, and I've been a senator for almost 6 years.
Yeah, wow. So you've been around, you've travelled the world. Why'd you get into finance initially before you became a senator? What was your motivation?
Well, look, it was at the time of the late 80s, I guess, when finance, it was, Wall Street was out, Bud Fox, Charlie Sheen and Gordon Gekko, and finance was, I guess I was a product of the 80s in that sense. I did seriously consider mining engineering or surveying as well, but, my dad really pushed me to go into accounting. He said there'll always be a job for accountants. I was always obviously very mathematically minded, and I guess having watched my dad grow up, I mean, we were fine, like we got by, but Dad was always sort of, it was always one drought. Like whenever we just get ahead, we'd have a drought or the wool crashed or something like that, or like we had to go and build a dam or something that would So I guess I wanted financial security, really. But interestingly enough, I had interviews with what was the big six accounting firms back when just the year I was going to graduate, and didn't get jobs with any of them. And I had a real chip on my shoulder about that. But looking back now, I can see why I didn't get the roles, because I wouldn't, even back then, I wouldn't say the things they wanted me to say in interviews. I can remember my first interviews with Coopers and Librarian, and their first question was, give us 10 words to describe yourself. And I'd grown up in a culture around, with mates whereby we did nothing but dump shit on each other if you like someone.
Yeah.
So the whole idea of self-promotion, and even, that was just the way we were back then. We were probably on the tail end of it, Generation X, but we were the opposite of woke. We were sort of like, you had to learn to take shit from your mates and laugh at yourself. And if you couldn't do that, that was the sort of test, if you could just take shit from your mates and laugh at yourself, that was what was cool. So I just stuffed up all my interviews and had to go back home to Dolby/Chinchilla, and it was a bit of a kick in the guts at the time, but looking back, it was actually a really good thing. And I was actually offered partnership for the firm I was in for when I turned 25, but I knocked it back to go travelling. But it's what it is, I guess.
Yeah, totally. Always not willing to conform, even at that age.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was never rebellious, and I'm still not, like, even now, like with the rallies and all that stuff throughout COVID, I'm still of the view you're much better off trying to influence decisions, in the boardroom, and you can't make decisions out in the car park, right? So, and as a politician, I'm not going to go to Canberra and not sort of try and play the game to an extent that I want to be able to influence decisions, right? There's no point going there and not just throwing your toys out of the cot every time, because you'll have no influence. And that's one thing, I was probably, I've matured into or grown into realize you do have to work with people even if you don't like them, because you want to be able to influence outcomes. And that's where you've got to treat people with respect and that, and things like that. But interestingly enough, if I'm ever asked in a job interview again, if I'm a team player, I'm going to actually say no. Not because I don't believe in treating people with respect, but I'm actually driven by outcomes. And you can be a team player is such a generic term, and you can be a team player in the sense that you don't necessarily raise issues. And I've seen that. That's one of the things politics is suffering from at the moment. Everyone's a team player to the extent that no one speaks up. There's that book by that Russian author Alexandria Solzhenitsyn, I think it's called The Gulag Archipelago, where he talks about at some Soviet meeting, the Soviet commander or whatever spoke, the leader spoke in front of a meeting, and they all got up and started clapping, and no one would stop clapping, so they just kept clapping, because the first person to stop clapping gets dragged out of the room, sort of thing. And it's a bit like we live in that culture today where, if you're one of the people that speak up about something, you just get your head shot off, literally, or, you're dragged out of the room. And I mean, and the living proof of that was within the Liberal Party. They basically threw me out at a pre-selection, albeit cheating. They got caught cheating, and even the Supreme Court judge said we can't rule on parties' constitutions, which means that the people that make the laws are above the law, which is a real worry in itself as well. And I'll talk about that close at the election. But so life's all about, you don't want to conform too much. I mean, you want to get on with people and you want to have their respect to be able to influence them. But, you've got to be able to speak up when you need to be able to speak up, because sometimes, and one of the best bits of advice I was ever given in business is that the only time you've made a mistake is when you know you've made a mistake and you don't do anything about it. And, sometimes you wake up in the morning and you don't know, if you've started businesses, right? You don't always know what the best path forward is, but you've got to take a step forward. Okay, if you end up in a dead end street, then made a mistake, go back, retreat, and go the other direction to see if that'll get you through to where you need to go. And that's the thing, is that you need to know when to cut your losses. You need to be able to admit you made a mistake, because no one ever got 100% for the subjects they did at school, right? From one of them, let alone, well, I never got 100%. I mean, I got close a couple times, but, for one subject, let alone all the subjects. And so you've got to acknowledge when you made a mistake and be humble enough to admit it. But the problem with team playing is it's very much a top-down approach whereby you're expected to sit there and conform. And that's the problem with our two major political parties today, is that none of the few people that do speak up, you take COVID, Craig Kelly, George Christensen, myself, we're all out. Alex is on the outer with the Liberal Party. You do get it held against you if you push back.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of that over the last few years. And to that point, you got to be willing to challenge the status quo. That's where results come from. If we just accept everything, don't question it, don't look for the BS in what we're being presented, how we're going to find truth and how we're going to find progress. And unfortunately, there's been a complete stop around that over the last 5 to 10 years. It's been mind-blowing.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting. I don't know when, I was just talking to someone else today. We were talking about quality assurance and just how people don't have the will to do the right thing. It's all too easy just to sort of take the low road instead of the high road. And that's a real worry, because as a country, if we don't take the high road and basically ensure that there's things like quality assurance in our jobs, in whatever we do, and do proper testing, if we don't have integrity in our system, we don't have transparency and accountability, systems start to fail. And we're seeing that across the country now in so many ways, whether it's a blowout in NDIS or politicians rorting the system or whatever it may be. And then that starts to breed distrust, and people lose confidence in their own system, and self-confidence and confidence in the world around you is very, very important.
Absolutely, for sure. Well said. Mate, tell me a little bit about the values instilled in you as a lad from Chinchilla in the country. How did that influence who you are today?
Well, look, that's a good question. It's interesting. I don't know how I became the person I did. I've been described as someone that is a deep thinker and thinks too much, and I think that's probably true. And then because I do think I have a conscience, and I know that I can't, something's on my conscience that keeps nagging me. And that was one of the reasons, going back to the COVID issue, when I had to withhold my vote from the party, because I knew enough to know that the stitch up was on over those injuries. I mean, it was already on over COVID, locking people out at the borders, locking up in hotel rooms, not letting them see their loved ones. And it was just that, I'd kept my mouth shut for the best part of 15 months. Well, internally I spoke up, but, I was getting nowhere, and I just thought, look, at the end of it, and this comes back to that team playing, I had to say, well, and this is the other thing, when they ask you, are you a team player? Well, which team are we on? And that was the thing. I thought, I'm not on the team of the LNP or the coalition. I'm on Team Australia and the people. And I felt as though, it had got to the point where, like, we'd lost the plot. And yet again, as I said, I want to be able to influence from within if you can, because you don't want to, once you go rogue, it's very hard to win that credibility back where you can continue to exert influence. But at the same time, I knew that something drastic had to happen, and I had to try and make a stand at least. And unfortunately, at the time, I was ridiculed for it being called an anti-vaxxer. Myself and Alex Andy took the stand. Craig Kelly had taken a stand. But I said in a post last night, I don't regret doing it, because I'd rather die on my feet than live on my knees. And if I don't get back into the next election, I'll be disappointed, because I would like to fight for Australians for another 6 years. But I'll know that I did the right thing, and I can live, my conscience can live free of knowing, should I, shouldn't have. It's like, absolutely, I should have. And there's two things I want out of this is to expose all the lies in COVID, but I also want to expose the weak and insipid politicians we have running this country and how they need to be held to account as well.
Well said, well said. I mean, this is what politics should be about. Individuals that have the clout and the courage and bravery to speak for truth, and in the face of judgment, criticism, whatever it may be, they still step up and do what's right. And we haven't seen enough of that, that's for damn sure. And you've been one of a few, but not many voices that actually had the courage to do that. And, we've had many conversations, and I was personally so grateful for your efforts during the COVID period. And I think what you did was absolutely phenomenal. So we'll talk more about that later. But again, hats off to you for all of that, because it would have been super hard. It was challenging for all of us individuals that were just living normal life doing it. But you, from a professional level, had so many different pressures coming at you. So I can't imagine how it was.
Look, it wasn't that hard for me, because as I said, because I got the conscience, it would have been harder to say nothing. And I was paid throughout that period, and I didn't get injured. So, look, I know that I'm lucky. If the worst thing happens to me and I don't get back in as a senator, well, I'm grateful for the 6 years I had, and I'll get my life back in terms of spending more time with my children. But really, it's been hard for the people that lost their jobs, have been injured, or had, couldn't say goodbye to their loved one. I mean, I'll tell you, I lost it early on, like not when I say lost it, I was just like, if my mother or father had died and the government said to me I couldn't be at their bedside when they were dying, I don't know what I would have done. I would have gone batshit, like the government doesn't get to tell people stop people from being with their loved ones when they're dying. Like that to me was just outrageous. And then even going to funerals, like what if your best mate had died and you weren't, like, say, they restricted funerals to 10 people. Well, like obviously that would be probably family members, but if my best mate died, I'm going to be there at his funeral. You know what I mean? Or I'll probably be at his bedside as well. So yet again, mate, like that's where there's just some things. I'm happy to drive, follow the road rules. I'm happy to pay my taxes. Within reason, but I'm not wasting money. But when you start violating those intrinsic human rights to such an extent, mate, that was just, just not right.
No, absolutely. There was a lot of extended abuses of power, and there's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
And it was an absolute shame. We'll talk more about that in a moment, but tell me a little bit about why you were motivated to become a senator. So you're in finance, you've traveled the world, you're doing good in business. Why were you motivated to get into politics? Where'd that come from?
Well, I'll give you two. I'll give you the broad answer and I'll give you the narrow answer. I'll give you the narrow answer first. What inspired? Well, the moment I seriously started considering to run for politics was when I was doing my Masters of Tax Law. And I was told about this section in the Tax Act 128F of the 36 Act called the Public Offer Test. And what that said was that if you issued a bond in the primary market, you don't have to pay withholding tax. Now, no one in the real world's going to understand what that means. But because of my background in Treasury and tax, I knew exactly what it meant. And the people who issue bonds in the primary market are big corporations and big banks. The minimum parcel to issue a bond in the primary market is $1 million. It's not the thing that anyone in the public can do, right? So it's not even a public offer test. It was a complete and utter lie, the Orwellian term. And who pays withholding tax? It was foreigners. So that meant that all the interest that we pay every year offshore to foreigners is tax-free. So, if your mum, is retired and she earns $10,000 a year in interest on her savings, she'll have to pay tax on that. Foreign banks don't have to. And so that really annoyed me because I'm like, hang on, why do foreign banks not have to pay tax and hardworking Australians do? And if she gave and as I further did my Masters of Tax Law, I realised there's just more and more rorts in the Tax Act that favours foreign business over domestic business. And, it's ironic they're all jumping up and down about Trump introducing tariffs today, but we've actually got our own Australian government has reverse tariffs on our own industries here in Australia, what I call reverse tax tariffs, by charging us 30 cents in the dollar for a company. If you make $100, you pay 30 cents in the dollar, $30 tax. But offshore, depending on tax treaty, you only have to pay between 0 and 15 cents. So if you've got an onshore tax rate here of 30 cents and an offshore tax rate here of 0.15, you're going to shift your profits offshore. Why are we doing that?
Yeah.
And while that's going on, the ATO is cracking down on small business here for being 2 days late with their BAS statement.
Totally.
Absolutely absurd. So that's when I knew I could start to add value with my knowledge. But look, why? Because basically my mum passed away 10 years ago this month, actually. And I guess I wanted to make sure that, my mum worked till 70 as a nurse. She lost a lot of money in the 87 stock market crash when she was about to retire as a 60-year-old. And then she stayed and worked another 10 years just to make sure she could leave something for us. I'm just so grateful for the opportunities that our forefathers gave to us. And I want to make sure that our children get the same opportunities that our forefathers gave to us because we owe it to our forefathers to make sure we do the same for our children. And we can't stuff it up. We are stuffing it up, and we've got to try and put the country back on track. That's the number one reason. Number two reason I want to stand up for Australians who try and stand up for themselves. I mean, if you get out of bed and put your nose to the grindstone every day, I want to make sure you're rewarded for your efforts. I don't want the government crushing you through over-regulation and over-taxing. And the third reason is I believe the role of government is to serve the people and not control them. And as I said in my maiden speech, 40 years ago, last 40 years, we've sold all the infrastructure that used to deliver essential services, and we've marched on into the family class, the family home, the classroom, the bedroom, doctor's waiting room through COVID, boardroom through superannuation, and we're telling people how to live their personal lives instead of actually sitting there building the big macro infrastructure projects that deliver recurring revenue to pay for schools and hospitals. That's what government should be doing, is being in the service industry, not the regulation of your private life industry.
Yeah, well said. Very well said. Well, it's been one of the biggest wake-up calls since becoming senator, like something that you think maybe we don't know about, but really sort of shook you a little bit and woke you up to the reality of things.
Look, the biggest wake-up call is I always thought the bureaucracy was nothing more than an arse-covering department. So, they'd be a big, bumbling bureaucratic department. I accept that, all big organisations, even, private corporations, you can have big corporations that are bumbling and they're not well managed. But I sometimes seriously question the motive of bureaucrats. Not all of them, Not all. I want to be clear about that. And by bureaucrats, I'm not talking about teachers and nurses and those guys. They're what I call public servants. They're our front end workers. I'm talking about the bureaucrats in Canberra and to a lesser extent the bureaucrats in George Street in Queensland here. But um, they do things that I don't think are in the nation's best interests. And even though they know that, they still do what they do. Take that tax example, for example, where we're rewarding offshore ownership instead of onshore ownership. Renewables, for example, we will now shut down our own domestic supply of materials, coal, gas, uranium, whatever, to instead import foreign-made renewables, and 75% of those renewable companies are foreign-owned. In 1985, when we lifted capital controls and let foreign debt into the country, that then created a debt bubble that in 2008 was going to pop because of the GFC. So then they had to let foreign students, they changed the law to allow foreign students to buy houses to prop up the housing market, right? So we are killing our children's future, and we know that we're killing our children's future, but we're not doing anything about it. And at some point you start to say, well, and I'm currently in a bingle with another senator about the definition of consent. Silence is consent, but so many of my colleagues know this and don't do anything about it, as well as the bureaucrats. And it's like, at some point we've got to stop this. Stop the train we're on and say we're going in the wrong direction, and actually turn it around. And start going in the right direction.
Yeah, totally. Give me some context around that point about shutting down our industry and importing internationally. Why would we do that when we have the resources here? Why is that happening?
Well, because it's become part of the climate change narrative that we have to rely on renewables. And of course, I mean, putting aside the climate change narrative about renewables, it's in doing that we decide, because we don't have the manufacturing capacity to make windmills, wind turbines and solar panels, right? And so we choose, in order to comply with foreign agreements, we choose to destroy our own energy grid, and so that's a good example. The tax one's another example. But yeah, I mean, even the COVID stuff where we were shutting down and overreacting, like there's all these, things that we're doing that just isn't in the national interest.
Yeah, it's super interesting and very concerning as well. And onto the COVID topic, I mean, you were a huge voice during that period of time, and we saw a lot of things that were completely unnerving, from, police beating individuals, and you saw people getting raided from doing posts. There was so much going on, but what was the worst thing you personally witnessed as a result of some of those policies through COVID?
Oh, the vaccine injuries, just horrendous. And, there's a lot of bad things, but the worst was when people were injured from the first shot and then had to go and get a second shot. There's that, and then there's just the gaslighting of people through compensation. I mean, we spent, it's estimated that the Australian government spent $500 billion on, paying people to stay at home, get brainwashed by the premiers. They spent something like, I forget now, $8 billion.
$500 billion.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Like we spent $8 billion on 300 million doses of the vaccine, 8 billion. That's 12 doses for every person. At the same time, they were saying 2 doses were enough. But yet they could spend, so if you take a quarter of that, so 12 doses, say you wanted 3, you could have spent 2 billion and saved 6 billion. But yet now I think the total payout so far for vaccine injuries is 27 million. Yeah, I'm still being contacted by people today, just a person from Rockhampton who's been injured from the vaccine. Still didn't know there was a vaccine compensation injury claim scheme, and I'm not even sure she would have qualified. But they'd had their lives destroyed. It's just, and that's the thing. And then of course, I could go on and talk about this all day, but even now there's no accountability. No one talks about it. They just want to move on to the next issue, and all, and I don't know. It'd be between 1% and 5% of the people have had their lives, damaged in one way or the other, whether it's the vaccines, whether it's business closures, whether they lost their business, or they've lost their jobs through mandates. It's still a lot of people have been, it mightn't be the majority of the population, but, it's a significant minority.
Well, it's enough, isn't it?
Yeah, it's enough. Yeah. And we've got to treat all people the same and make sure, look, it's different when someone becomes a drug user and they destroy their own lives because of their bad choices. That's one thing, right? But when you had your life destroyed because of bad choices, because of the government decisions, that's another thing altogether.
And the choice was removed.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Your life's basically been destroyed by a government mandate. Yeah, it's just not good.
Yeah, it was wild times. I mean, how did we get to a stage where inevitably in Victoria was the harshest lockdown in the world. I mean, there's clearly everyone was going through this, and out of all of the countries, Australia was the one that decided to make it the longest, the harshest, and really tax and I guess what's the best word? Spend and discipline society and brainwash and gaslight their people. How did we get in that position where Australia was the chosen one and Victoria out of everywhere was the longest in the world?
I think it was the way that our politics played out. Like, we're in the unfortunate position that Labor was so angry that they lost the election in 19. They were out to get Morrison no matter what. Out of the 6 state premiers and 2 territory premiers, there were 2 Liberals. So there were 6 Labor, 2 Liberals. Dan Andrews, Palaszczuk and Mark McGowan, highly influential people. So the premiers basically being Labor ganged up against Morrison. The premiers were very aggressive. Morrison was very weak. So they walked over, they walked over the federal government. The decision to allow, the High Court decision that allowed state borders to be closed added to it. Reckless economic decisions where the federal government effectively printed $300 billion to pay people to stay at home and get brainwashed by the premiers didn't help. And then we had this ludicrous situation in the media where every day the premiers coordinated their press conferences, one at 9, one at 10, one at 11, and then one of the smaller states would do one at 12. So you just had all the morning was dominated by press conferences about COVID cases. Now, if you did the same thing for traffic accidents and you stood up there every day and said this morning there was a traffic accident here, traffic accident there, that person was killed, that person was injured, put up the images of traffic accidents, you'd get people stopping drive. Like you wouldn't stop everyone from driving, but you could stop a lot of people from driving just through the sheer propaganda of reporting the same thing and the same thing and the same thing. I mean, we got to the ludicrous extent whereby we had Palaszczuk reporting that they'd found COVID in the sewage. Now, of course, the ironic thing about what was, if COVID was in the sewage but there was no cases, meant to say the people had COVID and didn't even know they had it, right? But yet they didn't pick up on that. But the whole fact that we were reporting down to that level of detail, like clearly they were looking to deliberately scare people, because who tests the sewage for COVID, right? So they were looking, to scare people. I mean, and look, this wasn't just an Australian thing. This was a worldwide coordinated mass propaganda campaign. Easily controlled because the mainstream media in this world is controlled by a handful of organisations, thanks to superannuation, forced savings. I mean, you talk about Australia being controlled with the COVID. We've got the 4th biggest superannuation savings in the world, despite having the 57th most populous country. So we force our people to save more money and give it to someone they've never met than any other country in the world. And we wonder why we've got a housing crisis and record levels of debt, because the money we would save has been given to someone else to play with for 40 years, while you live in poverty till you're 67, or, you live worse off until you're 67. So, we're overgoverned. I mean, we're 28 million people. We've got 1 federal government, 6 state governments, 2 territory governments, and then a whole heap of councils. I mean, even Brisbane, we're not too bad here in southeast Queensland. We've got Brisbane, Gold Coast, Logan, Moreton Bay and Ipswich. But you go to Sydney, they've got councils, they've got an inordinate amount of councils in Sydney, for example, and Melbourne. So we are an overgoverned country. And of course, the problem is, once you get too many levels of government, the bureaucrats take charge. And I would love to see the ratio of bureaucrats to front-end public servants. I think it's dropped. It's increased. Actually, it's the other way around. So we've got more front-end public servants, but that number's come down and our bureaucrat numbers come up. And I think, we need to do it the other way around and sack a lot of the bureaucrats and put them back into frontline services and get them serving rather than controlling.
Yeah, well said, well said. I mean, there were a lot of stats and things that weren't adding up during that period of time. And I'm curious, behind closed doors in Parliament, when you're having these conversations, how many of the politicians do you think really believed what was going on, and how many just went along with it? I mean, some of the stats, and correct me if this is wrong, but I believe it was something like a 99.9% survival rate, which sounds like almost identical to the flu. And then the amount of people dying in Australia, and I think pretty much globally, actually went down during that period of time. And then after lockdowns were released and the vaccine had taken place, the amount of people that were dying globally on a yearly basis actually went up after that. And so even if you're looking at some of the general stats like the survival rate, how come more individuals weren't calling that out and asking questions? Why are these solutions so extreme when the survival rate is so high?
Well, I mean, people were, but they were just being muzzled out by the fear-mongering propaganda narrative. So, obviously, like to Craig Kelly, myself, George Christensen, Alex Antic, later on Matt Canavan. Matt was initially, he'll admit this, he believed it initially, but then realised, as it went on, it was a con. And a lot of people were like that, right? Because you tend to trust your health professionals, right? It's one thing not to trust a politician, but you tend to trust your health professionals. But that stuff was muzzled, and they didn't really. But you make a really good point that, it was a very high survival rate. And not only that, the average age of death for people with COVID was more or less the same as life expectancy. But what happened here in Australia that was very unique was we actually got people vaccinated before we opened up. So we were quite a unique case. Now, what happened after we started rolling out the vaccines in March, April 2021 was that our death rate climbed by 10,000 in the last 8 months of 2021. And it was, so the last 8 months of 2021, there were 10,000 more deaths than 2020. Now, there was no COVID in the community, or next to no COVID in the community that year. Of those extra 10,000 deaths, there was only 400 extra in COVID. So what was the other 9,000 deaths from? Vaccines. There's really, I mean, you could argue there might have been a bit of delayed increase because of the delayed response to treatments from the year before. It literally, the month after the vaccine rollout, deaths jumped 7%. The correlation between the vaccine rollout and the jump in deaths was like a matter of weeks, which makes sense because it takes a couple of weeks for if you did die from it, you can not necessarily die suddenly, but then it takes another couple of weeks for the death to get registered with the ADS. So the correlation was almost perfect. And of course, they've been over backwards to gaslight that figure, but it's real.
Yeah, I mean, gaslighting and misinformation has definitely been prevalent. And, one of the things that was so concerning and blew my mind was how they were recording the deaths. And so anyone that died of anything, hit by a car, heart attack, anything at all, but if they had a trace of COVID, it'd be a COVID death. And of course, they would blame that and make us believe something that wasn't actually happening. What was your take on that during that time with the amount of gaslighting and the amount of lies that was sort of shown to us and pushed onto us during that period?
Yeah, there was a word for it. I remember the New South Wales, not Kerry Champ, but the other one, Susan someone. I remember she was talking about it in January, February 2022 with Dominic Perrottet standing next to her. And they called it back. That wasn't backtracking, it was back something. But she said basically that if you had COVID, even if you got hit by a bike, but you had COVID 2 weeks earlier and you got sent to hospital because of the bike injury, you were still counted as having COVID, as a COVID admission. And they were going backwards as well. So even if you had the accident after you caught COVID, they were still blaming COVID. It was just clearly contrived to make COVID worse than what it was. But look, we can go down some rabbit holes here in terms of motives. And this is what I'm saying. The biggest shock to me was that there are people pulling other people's strings. And not everyone's even aware that they're having their strings pulled. There's a term I've become, I've sort of tended to, I don't say it a lot because it's a pretty purgative term, but, the word useful idiot. And it's amazing if the media says something, people will adopt it just because it suits their political narrative, and they'll repeat it regardless of whether or not it's true or false. And we saw that with COVID. I mean, it was just, I copped some shocking abuse when I initially raised the issue of vaccine injuries. And I was called an anti-vaxxer and all this stuff, even though all my children were vaccinated. And I was like, no, these people are injured. I mean, either you care about their health or you don't. Doesn't matter if they got injured by COVID or the vaccine. They're injured, you got to help them. But yeah, no, there was a really big push on that. And then eventually when the numbers turned against them, because what happened was after they opened up late December 21, 10 million people caught COVID up until September 22. So it was clear that the vaccine didn't stop transmission, but yet, only a few months earlier, they were banning people off Facebook. I mean, this was the other thing, right? We had our own health department under the direction of Greg Hunt actually engaged MS Saatchi to start, an external firm to start advising Home Affairs if misinformation about the vaccines was being posted. And Facebook was liaising, foreign company working with a foreign company to dob in Australians. And I had a whistleblower come to me there whereby he was in that department and he contacted me because he said, I can't, he ended up getting sacked because he just said, I'm not, I think he actually said he told his boss he came to see me and ratted out his own, department, and they sacked him for it. But, that was the level of propaganda. And this is why, even though everyone knew that at the time, everyone just ignored it. I mean, it's like climate change now. We know that 50 years ago, or the late 70s, early 80s, people were told that if we didn't do something, the glaciers were going to melt and, it was all going to be over by 2025. And yet here we are, and really there's no discernible change in the weather. It's ironic about the cyclone on the weekend, because even though it's the first one we've had in our lifetime, it turns out that there are a lot of cyclones down this part of the world between the 50s and the 70s that I never even knew about. And some of them even got as far down close to Sydney. So, there you go.
It happens.
Yeah, it happens. So, but it's amazing how people can just not see it if it doesn't suit their narrative. They just ignore it. I mean, it's like the Iraq War, right? I mean, we have, take the Hamas situation where 1,000 people died, wrongly. That's tragic what happened. But 20 years earlier, we went and invaded a country for a lie based on, the lie that was the chemical weapons mass destruction. Probably 1 million people were killed in that war. And the perpetrators of that war, George Bush, Tony Blair, John Howard to a much lesser extent, but, he was still egging it on. They're still out there walking free. But if you were living in Iraq, you'd be going, well, I've had my country invaded, possibly my home bombed, my family members killed. They're going, what did I do to deserve this? And have they been compensated or so none of this is new. The same for Vietnam and, all these other wars that have been started. And we just got to consider ourselves lucky we're not been, nothing has happened to Australia, touch wood. But, this stuff does happen. And there are, unfortunately, winners and losers in life. And I have to say, this is, why I keep coming back to why we've got to be involved in politics, because we want to keep on the right side of the ledger and make sure Australia doesn't degenerate into a third world country that's stricken by poverty. Because if we're stricken by poverty, very quickly it'll be followed by war. If you're hungry and your whole mindset changes, right? When times are tough, it's very hard to maintain a positive outlook on life.
Yeah, desperation can change people. That's for damn sure. Yeah, look, to your point about people not standing up, I mean, it was shocking to me how many individuals could see that things weren't right, could see that people were being gaslighted, that we were being forced into these terrible positions, and not only ignored it, but then just joined the common narrative because they didn't want to be frowned upon, or they didn't want to cop criticism. So they just joined the bullies so they didn't have to get bullied. And, I'm asking myself, we're the world looks at us and, the Americans look at Aussies like we're tough Aussie battlers. We're meant to be some of the hardest and strongest minded individuals in the world. And I was blown away at how freaking soft we were, how soft the individuals were to just cop that, not speak out and know it was wrong and do nothing about it. And worse yet, go along with it. Did that shock you, or did you sort of have a gut instinct that was going to go down?
Yeah, look, it disappointed me. It didn't probably shock me. I had a colleague, I was not a colleague, a political colleague, but just a friend, I guess. And he said, there's a key difference between America and the States. Australia was created as a prison colony, and we very quickly were told, sort of whipped in the line and had to toe the government line. I mean, we were effectively a government creation, modern Australia. Right, whereas the USA, they were an anti-establishment creation. I mean, they literally gave the middle finger to the British and said, "You're not going to no taxation without representation, and we're going to use our own currency." So when I, as I said, I traveled the world. I had some time in the States, and I was working back in the 90s. I went fishing one afternoon with the husband of one of my staff at the time. And his name was Woody, and I had a mullet and a cat. I was living in Florida, and he picked me up in the Ford F-150, and, we cruised, and, we sort of sitting there, the bench seat. And I said to Woody, what's the go with guns? What's the go with you guys and your guns? Why are you so, gun mad over here? Because, I grew up with guns. I don't have gun lights or anything now because it all changed when I was overseas. And he goes, we don't trust the government. Yeah. And this was back in the 90s. Now, the biggest political scandal of the 90s was Bill Clinton getting a blowjob from Monica Lewinsky, right? And I was like, yeah, as if, what do you got to worry about your government? I'd grown up in this real golden era of sort of, the 70s are tough, but I was a bit too young, but the 80s and the 90s, the wall came down in 89 with Berlin. 90s was a relatively peaceful time before September the 11th, and I can just remember thinking, yeah, as if. But now I look back and I can understand it more in terms of they know that their whole culture, or at least the patriotic part of the Trumpian MAGA movement, that they go back to that 1776, as they say, 1776 beats 1984. And that's in the American psyche, as in, we just don't trust Washington. And even in Queensland here, where 1,000 kilometres from Canberra, down here on the Gold Coast, we look at Canberra as being the enemy, right? But if you think about it, if you're in 50, you got 50 states in Americas, and it's all controlled on the East Coast from Washington. Like if you're out in Utah or Texas or wherever, you're thousands of kilometres away from Washington, you have even less trust in the government. So yeah, there's a real healthy skepticism in government process, and they really push back. But the other thing I like about the American government, and this has changed my view, I've changed my view since being in politics, is a couple of things. First of all, so they have over there, their executive sits outside of Parliament, right? So you know how we're supposed to have separation of powers, judiciary, Parliament, and the executive. Our executive sits within the Parliament. So we don't really have a true separation of powers between the executive and Parliament. So in the party room, almost half the party room today, especially as the government of the day is getting smaller, because it's we're now getting minority governments and more crossbenchers. So you might have less than 100 in the caucus. So the caucus is made up of the lower house members plus the senators. You'll have something like 30 ministers, maybe another 10 assistant ministers, and another 10 or 20 committee chairs. So over half your party room nearly is either a minister or wants to become a minister. So if you speak up, you're in the minority right inside the party room. Now, that's not the way it should be. In the States, they don't call them ministers, they call them secretaries. So Secretary of Defense, Foreign Secretary, they're handpicked by the president, right? So they don't sit in Parliament. So then you'll get a true clash between Congress and the executive if they don't get on. And they have elections every 2 years in their Congress. So you can have a change of balance of power. And so there's a real holding each other to account, the executive but here, the executive and the Parliament are pretty much entwined. And so the executive exerts too much power on the Parliament. It needs to be the other way around. That needs to change here in Australia. That would obviously require a constitutional change. The other thing is we actually need optional voting. I didn't used to support optional voting because I thought, no, everyone voting is a good thing. It creates stability. But unfortunately, that stability has become stagnation. And it's that the major parties capitalise on the ignorance and the apathy of many Australians who, quite rightly, and I totally get it, I can empathise with this, can't stand politics. They just go up, they don't want to vote, they go up, they'll either go informal, or if they do vote, they'll just vote one of the two parties. And that's made it really hard for minor parties to do well, because we get no media attention in the press unless it's one of us doing something stupid. They'll only ever report on a minor party senator if it's, most of the time, if it's a pile-on or that, it's when they're misbehaving rather than behaving. And that's one of the things I'd like to do with People First, is actually lift the level of professionalism amongst the crossbench so we can actually provide a viable alternative to the two major parties, because we need to be more professional and polished so if we want to do that. So, yeah, that's some of the differences between the Australian and American system that are worth pointing out.
Yeah, they've definitely got a different mindset towards sovereignty and towards the country in general, and patriotism. That's another thing that really upset me was, and still does, is how many people don't look to the flag and they're not inspired. Anyone that has an Australian flag, or you speak about it, you come across as you're racist or you're judged by it, and it's not a point of pride anymore, which is a real concern when you look to the future. But back onto the COVID saga, we won't spend too much time because I'm sure you're as sick of talking about it as I am. Yeah. But do you feel like, where there is control, where there is gaslighting and everything sort of went down in that sphere, there's got to be money incentive across the board. And I was always trying to put the pieces together, who was getting paid and what was happening for this to take place. We know the media was getting massive tax breaks, and there was stuff happening there financially in order to push them to promote the message. Was there anything happening that you know of in regards to the political side with the premiers, etc., getting any other financial incentives to do what they did and hold the line the way that they did on some of these policies?
Not explicitly between politicians and, the pharmaceutical companies. Where it happens is effectively the lobbyists. A lot of lobbyists are ex-ministers, and they go directly to... So the lobbyists and the ministers talk between each other that way. But what it is as I say, the brown paper bag of yesterday, where you give a brown paper bag of cash under the table or whatever, has been replaced by red tape, black tape, blue tape, green tape. It's today's corruption sits inside the bureaucracy through the overregulation of people, and they become hammers looking for nails, and they create rules that then justifies their job. So you take the current thing, we've moved on from COVID, but there would be people, you'll read it in the press today, oh, we're not prepared for the next pandemic. We're not prepared for the next pandemic, right? That is a form of corruption right there. These people who are saying that are selling their own book. In other words, they're saying, I'm an expert for COVID or infectious disease. I need to keep my government job. So I'm going to say you need to keep me because there's another pandemic just around the corner. Likewise for climate change. No one's ever going to put their hand up in the climate change department and say climate change was a hoax. Because if they did that, it's like no job, right? So you get these people with vested interests who basically talk their own book. They become hammers looking for nails. I think there's something like 28 or 30 days, different days to recognise Aboriginal, Sorry Day, National Reconciliation Day, National Reconciliation Month, or there's, Transgender Day or something like that. You've got people in departments looking to create a day because then they can, on that day, do something, hold events and that, and then they'll justify, we need to be here for the next year to do it for next year, right? So it's all of these people create jobs for themselves. And so it's not the brown paper bag corruption. It's the, do we need this job or not? And they're making up the rules to justify their position, even though the rules aren't needed at all.
Yeah, interesting. There's a bit of talk in the US about the regulators in the Senate and like someone like Nancy Pelosi who will get laws coming through them. They will push them through or not, and then simultaneously invest in the stock market in companies that they know they're going to reap the benefits from. Do you see anything like that happening in Australia? Is there similar rule sets around that in Australia as in America? And do you see that at all?
Yeah, so we have to disclose all our interests, okay? And my understanding of it is, I've never been a minister, but my understanding of it is if you're a minister, like you're basically told to sell all your shares in that particular area. So I know like my former colleague, Matt Canavan, when he was resources minister, he wasn't allowed to own any shares in resource companies and he didn't, right? I don't think it's as bad here in Australia. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. It's certainly not as bad as in the States. Like, over there, you see these people go in. Even they had that, what's her name? The Democrat congresswoman from New York, and even she's become a multimillionaire. So you don't see that so much here. But what you do see, though, is they know if they speak out, they lose their job. So you don't need to bribe them with people. A lot of people here with money, you just got to bribe them with the threat of losing their job. And for many people here, their job, they're getting paid more in that job than they would in the real world. So they just shut up because they know they'll lose their job. And for many of them, but where you really do, in my view, have a lot of corruption is with the lobbyists. And we do have a lobbyist register in Australia, but so if you're a lobbyist, you've got to disclose you're a lobbyist, but they don't disclose who their clients are. So one lobbyist, for example, is probably the most powerful lobbyist in Australia, Michael Photius, the next New South Wales State Minister. He works at a company, I think it's called, it's not State Street, it's Premier State or something like that. I know that the pharmaceutical companies were his clients, but he never had to disclose how much he was paid by those pharmaceutical companies. And he was close to Gladys Berejiklian. Right, I know that from my time in the Liberal Party in New South Wales. So that could have been a connection. I'm not saying it was, but yet again, people don't necessarily say to you, if you do this, you'll help me win this contract. They just influence, they'd create the state of fear, knowing that they'll profit from it, if that makes any sense. Yeah, so, if you're in the renewables industry, you're not going to say, we want a subsidy for renewables. You're going to say, well, let's sell the climate change mantra, knowing that you'll get kickbacks on here. But that create the narrative to then
get their agenda met.
Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. So we had it was an absolute cluster F during the COVID phase, a lot of vaccine injuries, which you've been fighting so hard for. What have you seen in regards to that? And what do we not know about that? Are there things that haven't been broadcasted on the news and things that we don't understand about the vaccine injuries that you're seeing?
Well, what the media won't tell you is there's a lot more people injured than they let on. A lot more people died than they let on. That the injury compensation scheme wasn't broad enough. So many people were injured who didn't get compensation. Lots of people have lost their houses. Some people have committed suicide over it, but effectively they gaslight a lot of it. I guess my concern is the continued use of mRNA vaccines as opposed to protein vaccines. They clearly didn't work, and yet they're building a $2 billion Moderna factory down in Melbourne. And I'm sort of like, well, what are they? Yeah, and they're going to make 100 million vaccines a year. And then so my concern there is, well, yet again, this is the hammer looking for the nail. If you're making 100 million vaccines a year, you're going to have to put them in people's arms. So what are they going to do to create that, to sell these things?
Yeah, where's the demand going to come from?
Yeah, exactly. And if you look back at the whole COVID issue, Anthony Fauci, the day before President Trump was inaugurated back in 2017 in his first term, at Georgetown University, he said that there will be a surprise infectious disease outbreak throughout the term of President Trump's presidency. And you're like, why would you relate an infectious disease outbreak to someone's political term? That's got nothing to do with anything.
Very strange.
If there is a bunch of mosquitoes coming up from Mexico and you'd said, oh, look, we've got a swarm of mozzies coming and they're going to carry this, they're potentially carrying this disease. Yeah, it's got the pathogen, and the carrier of that pathogen coming makes sense. But and this is what I mean about strings are being pulled, and some of these people that are saying these things do have motives over and beyond, and it's at the very high level. But yeah, it concerns me what happened in COVID. Obviously, we've never got the accountability that we'd love that to happen, but it concerns me that COVID, it wasn't just the vaccines. COVID itself, as we know now, came from the Wuhan laboratory. It was engineered from the laboratory. They went to a great extent to try and cover it up. That's subsequently been debunked that it was actually a natural outbreak. The CIA was involved in the cover-up. All these things need to be, are concerning when you've got your own not our intelligence agency, even though there's a bloke called Professor Edward Holmes from Sydney University was liaising with Anthony Fauci very early on. Why Fauci would talk to a professor from Sydney University, I have no idea. But this guy was also deputy director of the Chinese CDC. And he was one of the key authors of the paper, the Lancet paper, that said it's not an outbreak from a laboratory, when in fact it was. So even our own our own intelligence agencies have questions to answer. And that's what's concerned me. I've got a real issue that the intelligence agencies are driving a lot of the agenda. And there's some real issues with our Western intelligence agencies that, over and beyond the bureaucrats, these guys have enormous influence.
It's a scary thought.
Yeah, it is a scary thought.
You mentioned accountability. Are we going to see any? Like, is it possible? Is it going to happen? I mean, I know you've been fighting for it and a few others, but how and will it actually happen?
Well, how will be in getting more independents into the Senate. So you do not vote for the major parties at the upcoming federal election. Put them last if you're voting in the lower house, and you don't need to vote for them at all in the Senate. Vote 1 to 6 minor parties. Preferably People First one. But that's what we need, because outside the independent, the two major parties were both in on it, and they do not want to be held to account. And we have to keep pushing for that. And not just, first thing we have to push for is compensation for their vaccine injury and to see that they get the proper care and attention. But we also need to hold these people to account.
Yeah, totally. I completely agree. And hopefully everybody listening to this will take that strategy to the ballots and actually implement it, and we'll hopefully see some change. In regards to this happening again, I mean, look, I guess vaccines and pretty much forcing individuals to take vaccines isn't a new concept. I mean, we sort of do that with childcare.
Yeah.
You're forced to get it, otherwise you can't put your kids into childcare, and there's a whole bunch of things that take place in general. But the lockdowns are a new extreme, and of course, forcing it on every individual in Australia almost was another new extreme. Is that going to happen again, and could it happen again? And how are we going to stop that moving forward? There are things being put into place now where, after seeing the detrimental impact of the lockdowns and these vaccine injuries, will it be stopped, or is it possibly going to happen again soon?
Well, it can possibly happen again. How soon it happens, I don't know. These things tend to, they keep mixing the crises up. So, we went from the climate change crisis into COVID crisis. Now we've got the Ukraine-Russian war. The Israel-Palestine issue. So there's constantly, I'm concerned there'll be a financial crisis in the wings to bring Trump down, because globalists don't want tariffs. They want to shift the world from the Western world over to Asia. To a large extent, it's already happened. So I'm looking for a financial crisis, possibly, an outbreak. They're really like drones. Ukraine put a heap of drones into Moscow last night as Trump was trying to, have peace talks in Saudi Arabia with Russia. The next crisis might necessarily be COVID. My big fear, and this is the thing, even, COVID turned out to be, I do think it was real. I think there was a virus out there that made people sick. Viruses do, or whatever you want to call them. There's a certain pathogen out there that, respiratory pathogen that makes people sick. My big fear is if these muppets in the doing gain of function research actually create a pathogen that is deadly serious. And it's more than a respiratory disease, especially if it's a bloodborne disease. Always be very wary of the bloodborne ones. Things like malaria, or anything that spreads through the blood, because that tends to be more severe than, your respiratory ones, generally speaking, generalization. So the question there is, with the gain of function research, is that's actually create a pathogen that does get released that is much more deadly than what COVID was. So it'd be great to stop it. I've actually asked ASIO, what are you doing about, regardless of whether it's intended or not, gain of function research in universities, and they've washed their hands of it. So gain of function research occurs in about 17 Australian universities now.
Wow.
And they've got a really high security CSIRO facility, I think in Melbourne, where they do some really high-tech gain of function research with deadly pathogens. So, and that's just in Australia. I mean, you can go across the world. So, look, it definitely can happen again. It's a real risk. And if they wanted to make it happen, they could make it happen. And even if it wasn't a serious pathogen, they could still do the media beat up to make it seem like a real pathogen, lock us down again. So that's a concern. Would they do that so soon after the last one? I think they'll probably kick the can down the road a bit. My big fear is World War III breaking out. That's a genuine
fear.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's Trump, to his credit, is trying to at least stop the war. And then the European aristocrats, so the deep states, now that Trump's got in, has moved from Washington back to Brussels. They're now not allowing this George, I can't pronounce his last name, the dude in Romania that won the last election. They've overturned that result. Romania, along with Poland, is two key entry points into Ukraine, because Hungary, Viktor Orban's against what goes on there, and Slovakia as a part of the old Czechoslovakia. It's another country that borders Ukraine. They're not on board either, so they cannot allow Romania to fall into the hands of patriots who don't want war. So they're stopping the democratic process there. That's what they did in Ukraine back in 2014.
Yes.
They're repeating that. So I'm concerned. The two big risks I see, and I mean, look, I'm not a futurist, I can't see, but I'm concerned there's going to be a big financial crash, or World War III. I hope while Trump's in, he'll do his best to stop World War III, but they're doing their best to undermine Trump.
Yeah, legitimate concerns.
And sorry to cut you off there, Andy. Albanese and Dutton are all on side of the Europeans. Saying
why? Why is it? Why are they?
I don't know. I would have thought, our best chance of, protection in this country is the United States, given that, we've allowed our military, and even if we had the best military, we'd still need help from the States. We got the Chinese Navy sailing around Australia, and these guys, Dutton and Albanese, are doing their best to annoy Trump. And Trump doesn't suffer fools, right? So, he's jeopardising our relationship with the US.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that note of the Chinese subs, and I know they're currently lurking around Australia, so to speak, is China a concern? And what are your insights on why those subs there, and are they a threat to us at all?
Well, they're definitely a threat if they wanted to be. Is China a concern? Potentially. China doesn't have a history of invading other countries. They just tend to sort of, use trade, and there's a Chinatown just about in every big city in the world. China is a potential threat. You got to treat them like a threat, but that, we've also got to work with China. 1.4 billion people, 6,000-year-old civilization. They're not going anywhere. They're our biggest trading partner. So, we've got to work with China. Obviously, and it's not just China. As a sovereign country, we need to be able to defend ourselves. That's not because we want to be aggressive. It's because it's just called risk management.
The country does, right? I mean, it's our right now, and we need to.
Yeah, it's like when you put an alarm system on your house, or you put a grilled, screen door over your other door, or you deadlock it. You don't want to use it, but it's called defence. And we do need to remind ourselves that our soldiers join the Australian Defence Force, not the Australian Offence Force. And as a sovereign country, we're entitled to defend ourselves. So regardless, putting China here, it's not a question of, whether or not China's a threat. Well, it is, but We just need to be capable of defending ourselves, and we need to. But as I said in my maiden speech, sound diplomacy and strength of position is the key basis of any national security, and that's what we need to be doing. Is we still need to keep our diplomatic ties. We need to work with all our neighbours. We're an isolated country in the South Pacific, small population, large landmass. So we really, as I said before, when I was talking about the ability to influence people, we need to be able to maintain those relationships with our neighbours so that we, in times of trouble, we can try to influence at least the outcomes, and we get good outcomes. I mean, there's no point of being completely isolationist to the point of no one wants to talk to you.
No, exactly right. Of course not. And we need to be a player in the global market as well, of course. Exactly. And do we know why those subs are there? Is there any intel on that, or it's still unspoken about?
Look, I don't know why. I mean, our Navy goes up into international waters near the South China Sea, and, the Chinese don't like it when we go up there and do war games up there. I don't know the ins and outs of what the Chinese subs are doing here. My understanding of it is if they're here, they're in international waters. They're entitled to go cruising around international waters. I suspect it was a test of the relationship we have with the US, and China's just rattling its spears, to see what sort of reaction, and they got the reaction. I mean, our media went off about it, and then Dutton accused Albanese of being weak. To be fair to Albanese, there's plenty of things you can criticise him about, but I'm not sure that he can have the idea that the Australian Prime Minister can tell the Chinese Navy where they can and can't go in international waters.
For sure.
Is a bit over the top. So,
we've got nice speeches that way. They might have just wanted to come over for a fish and sunbake.
Well, I mean, that's actually, the Chinese fishermen and, fishing off in other waters, that's quite an issue. I mean, ask the Philippines, and I think they're even as far away as Argentina and places like that. When you got 1.4 billion people to feed, I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
But as I said, I mean, we've got to work with China, we've got to work with India, Indonesia, all our neighbours, and, try and maintain open lines of communication.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, on that note of defence, I was watching one of your social media posts, and you're talking about the Defence Force and how hard it is for average Australians to actually recruit. And by the sounds of things, we've actually got a challenge at the moment with the Australian military in recruiting enough individuals to, fill the spots, so to speak. So why are they making it so freaking hard to join the Defence Force?
Well, I'm glad you raised that, Andy, because since I posted that clip last week, I've had probably 50 people contact me to say that they cannot get into the military. And I am shocked. Now, this is one of those things where at first I thought, it's an isolated case here and there, and, but I keep getting the same story, fit, able-bodied men, relatively healthy. One person apparently had asthma, was told that they couldn't join because he had asthma. He never had asthma in his life. He went and got a doctor certificate to say he's never had asthma in his life. They still wouldn't let him in. One person was disallowed because they had tats in the wrong spot, and as he said, he's got friends in the military with tats all over them. One had an allergy. I forget which nut it was. So they wouldn't let him in for that reason. But some of the reasons, and interestingly enough, I'd say about half the people who contacted me have been the parents or the children of veterans. So these people are, very patriotic, et cetera, et cetera. Now, it is hard not to draw conclusions when you get that big of a response. I mean, I know 50 is not a lot in terms of the whole recruitment program, but you got to understand my videos only go to a certain percentage of population. But you're sort of wondering, why are these people doing this? And is it because DEI practices where they're only allowing one, white male in for, and things like that? Now I don't want to. That's an unfounded. I'll say it's not unfounded. There's some evidence of it, but that's a spurious claim in some regards, and I think the military would never admit that. But you do have to ask yourself, why would you be knocking people back? I mean, especially if they want to join. I mean, to me, half the battle of being a soldier is wanting to be in that army. Yeah. The worst thing you want is soldiers who don't want to be there, right? So if you've got willing people and able participants, doesn't really matter what their skill set is. You can teach them to do a lot of things. And if they're willing to fight, they're willing to fight, right? That's what it is. I mean, fighting, the main game with fighting is wanting to fight. And
I mean, they openly admit that they're struggling with recruiting and that the systems aren't well-oiled to attract and actually get people on board. So again, the question is, if that's the case and they're struggling so much to fill quotas, why aren't they letting these individuals through the door?
Well, the other part of that question too, needs to be addressed is also the process. So they've outsourced a lot of recruiting. Now, yet again, if you've got a recruitment agency and their job is to be seen to be doing something, if they're just letting everyone in, someone will go along, why do we have a recruitment agent at all? So I'm yet again thinking, well, we should never outsource. So if you read Machiavelli's The Prince, he says in chapter 12, he says, never use auxiliaries or mercenaries, right? Never outsource anything if you can do it yourself. I mean, this is the thing. Payroll departments went from being payroll departments, human resource departments. And instead of recruiting people, which is what they used to do in paid payroll, they now do all this, woke stuff. I don't like using the term, and they've outsourced the very thing they should do, recruiting people to external agencies. And that's what the military's done. Well, yet again, I mean, you can have lots of people who've retired from the military that can't get jobs that could actually go into recruiting for the military and being mentors for young men and women who want to join the military and do personal development and mentoring and things like that for them within the military to knock them into shape, as they say. So very odd, and in reaction to it, I've been shocked by. I'm surprised by just how many people have contacted me on that just in the last week.
Yeah, well, I guess that story is still unfolding, and I'll be interested to keep watching your socials to get updates on that one because it's confusing and obviously a necessity for everybody. I mean, that our safety relies on that overall. So yeah, it's quite interesting. One of the other, I'm going to keep talking about your social media because I'm a big fan of your socials, mate. But one of the other interesting posts that I saw was one where you're speaking about the Australian gold stores. And a lot of people don't know that our gold reserves are stored overseas. So why is that and who benefits from that? Why would we store our gold internationally?
Right. Well, I've asked that question to the RBA many, many, many times, and they go, the answer that they give is that it's a more liquid market in London. Now, the problem with that is they'll then turn around and say that our gold never moves. Now, when they say the more liquid gold market, they like to lease it out. Now, I have a real problem when they lease out gold because that's creating an artificial supply. Now, our gold, we have the world's largest gold reserves in ground, not above ground stored in vaults, but we have the largest gold reserves, mainly in Western Australia. We're the world, or it might be the second largest, but the world's biggest exporter of gold. Why is our own central bank shorting the gold to push the price down? And the reason why they do it, and they won't admit to this, but it's known, everyone knows about the London Gold Pool, is that they collude with other central banks to keep the price of gold down so that people use paper instead of gold. Because if they start, people realise that, this money printing, and they are, this is why the gold price is starting to take off, is coming to an end. You can only, there's nothing wrong with issuing credit, but you've got to secure it against an asset. But for too long, they've been issuing unsecured credit, which has been secured against our children's taxes or our taxes, our children's future, right? So people are starting to wake up and go, well, why would we buy any more of this paper, especially after COVID and the money printing that went on there? So they're starting to see gold again as a store of wealth. And then, of course, what's interesting is now that there's talk of auditing Fort Knox, suddenly there's been this massive transfer of gold bars from London over to New York and what they suspect is Fort Worth, because they've been selling all these paper gold so that it's estimated, and look, don't quote me on these numbers, but the amount of paper gold sold in comparison to real gold, and by paper gold, just derivatives and things like that, it's something like 10 to 1.
Wow.
And that's not just gold. I mean, I was listening to my dad sent me a Queensland Country Hour article last year on Queensland Country Hour on the ABC. They had a cotton conference, and as this bloke who trades cotton says, there's about $40 billion of physical cotton sold in the world, but the derivative market for cotton is about $300 billion. So you've got buyers and sellers in the market, but we have this thing called speculators, and they often deal in derivatives. I understand this from a treasury background. But those derivative markets are killing financial markets in the sense that, the producers are often getting screwed, or the consumer, because the middleman's clipping the ticket. And the middleman's created by forced compulsory superannuation, whereby these people are given power over trillions of dollars of wealth. And, you might know them as BlackRock or Vanguard or whatever, but it comes about because of compulsory superannuation. So we contribute, Australia has $3 trillion under industry and retail funds, plus another $1 trillion in self-managed super funds. That gives enormous power to these fund managers to manipulate, certain commodities or whatever. But it's interesting with the gold, like I don't think our gold bars should be stored over there. But I've been given the serial numbers of our gold bars, and most of our gold bars have been melted down have been refined since 2015 onwards. So that contradicted an earlier statement that the RBA made that said our gold bars never move, because clearly they do, because they've been melted down, or they've only been refined recently. So what happened to the old ones?
Why would they do that? Why would they melt down?
Well, this is the question. And the question is what they're doing is that they're selling too much gold, so they have to melt it down and then re-stamp it with a new serial number. And this is the problem. I've got the serial numbers as well. The RBA has admitted that has acknowledged the Bank of England has admitted to them that they've been busted, the Bank of England, this is, with fake gold bars and duplicate serial numbers. And the reason why they're doing that is that they're telling different countries at the same time, this is your serial number. So the serial numbers that Australia has, Austria could also think that they own those gold bars. We don't know until it's all disclosed, right? And that's why we need the full proper audit, but it needs to be audited by gold bar, by serial number, across all central banks at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, interesting. When you say we've got golden bars and they melted down, the first thing that comes to mind is, are they mixing anything with the golden bars? Are they creating more out of the same amount, cutting it in some way?
Exactly.
Which I think I heard a story about that happening in Australia somewhere, didn't we? Where we found that the gold bars weren't actually pure gold bars anymore, and they were...
I think that might have been the Perth Mint, where they weren't quite to weight. Yeah, and I mean, you can use things like tungsten, which is a very heavy metal after gold. They say lead. Yeah, it's just, look, I'm not so much, that stuff's important. Why gold matters is that it's an insurance against the stupidity of central banks. Central banks start printing too much money or start acting too recklessly. People lose faith in the monetary side of things and then go back to storing their wealth through gold. Because let's say, for example, China was to invade Australia, our dollar bills, our currency would become worthless overnight. A currency is backed by its government. So what happens when countries tend to fall is that their currencies disappear and then people flee. So they have to, this is where gold, because gold's 16 times heavier than any other metal, and it's maybe not so much in Australia because you just can't walk to another country, but in Europe where you had all these other countries, if there was a war in one, you could flee from the war. You can't take your land or your house with you. So you take your gold, as much gold as you can carry, and that will be exchanged in another country, because every country accepts gold, recognises gold, but not other. And yet you won't recognise, if Australia was to collapse tomorrow, the government, no other country would accept your dollar bills. Yeah, it'd be worthless.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, mate, you're obviously still Senator, and you're running for the People First Party. This is your party. You were in the Liberal Party, and now that you've got your own, tell me about why were you motivated to start your own party, and what do you stand for? What are you fighting for now?
Okay, well, thanks, Andy. So effectively why I started my own party is I want to keep fighting for Australians. I did lose my pre-selection with the Liberal Party because of the stance I took over the handling of COVID. Obviously the party decided that I had to follow the party rather than stand up for the people, and I couldn't, agree with that. So I wanted to, but one of the benefits of going out on my own was it gave me the autonomy and the freedom to talk about policies and solutions. Because what's happened with politics today, it's degenerated into a cat fight whereby it was just, the Labor Party bashed the Liberal Party bashed the Labor Party. Australians are sick of it. They're sick of the fighting. They're sick of the swamp in Canberra. They want to see solutions. And what we are about is solutions. We want to be solutions focused. We don't want to degenerate into the typical fighting between two major parties or, just complaining and bickering. We want to offer, a vision for our future. Because as I said to you earlier, I want to make sure our children get the same opportunities as our forefathers gave to us. And to do that, we need to rebuild this country. And so what we stand for are lower taxes. We want to lift the tax-free threshold to $40,000. That'll enable people to keep another $3,500 more in their take-home pay. We want to make childcare support flexible and paid directly to the parents so they can choose the type of childcare they want. There's millions of shift workers out there that work part-time or they can't pick their child up at 6 o'clock at night because they're working weekends, they're working till 10 o'clock at night. So we think they can't access institutionalised childcare. So if they want to get a nanny, they can do that. We want to make superannuation voluntary so young people can save up for their home faster or pay their mortgage off quicker. We want an infrastructure bank that's going to effectively build infrastructure. So instead of us borrowing money from offshore, we want to issue shares. So effectively, we as a sovereign country own the rights to all the rainfall, all the sunlight, all the soil. So we want all the minerals in that soil. So, if BHP were to come out next Monday and say we're going to issue new shares to build a uranium mine or a coal-powered fire station, no one would bat an eyelid. So why can't the Australian government issue new infrastructure bonds to the state government to open up a new coal-powered fire station or a new uranium nuclear power plant, whatever, or build a new dam? Why do we use foreign debt? So we want to also offer that as an infrastructure bank to start funding the way we construct infrastructure, so we're not paying interest to build our own assets, because we pay billions of dollars offshore every year to foreign banks to basically use our own currency to untap our own wealth. So they're the key policies. But as we spoke earlier, I want to lift the offshore tax rate. Billions of dollars flow offshore every year that aren't taxed. We need to start taxing that. So I want to lift the withholding tax rate on profits sent offshore. We've got a number of other policies. We want to lift the GST threshold of $250,000. It was $75,000. The threshold for GST was $75,000 when it was introduced in 2000. That hasn't been changed in 25 years. We're looking at income splitting for families as well to give greater flexibility to families. We want to change our whole health system. We want to get rid of APRA. We also want to split the TGA up. We want to get rid of no pay, no jab. We don't think the parents should have to get vaccinated, or children should have to get vaccinated to go to childcare, or if families, or to receive family benefit Part A.
Yes.
All of that needs to go. We need to bring back liability for vaccines as well, so that pharmaceutical companies pay for vaccines. So there's some other issues as well. We also want a independent judicial commission to review the performance of judges. We don't think we need greater scrutiny of our judicial system. We're bringing in whistleblower protection laws that are designed to protect whistleblowers in the public service that want to speak out. We also want to bring back the cross-media ownership laws, where we break up the power of the big media monopolies, so that there's, effectively our media now is controlled by the ABC, the News Corporation, and Channel 9 Fairfax. We need to split all that up again, because it's too easy to control to control the narrative through those three funnels. And we want to make sure that it's easier for guys like yourself, social media influencers, to get their voice heard as well. So there's some of the policies that we're looking at introducing.
Mate, I love it, and I love your policies personally, but I think one thing's for sure, and I say this with absolute confidence, there's a lot of seemingly weak and individuals out there that don't really believe in what they say, and they don't stand up for what's right. And one thing I will say about you, mate, is that you're proven. You've proven that you believe in something, you will fight for it when everyone's against you, when you face huge adversity and people even shunning you, you still will step up and fight for what's right. And that's the sort of leadership we need in Australia. So when I say that about you, I absolutely mean it. And I really, really, really hope, my friend, that you get a win on the board, because we need more honest individual politicians like yourself that actually give a shit about Australia, but are fighting for what's right, and will have the confidence and the clout and the courage to speak their truth no matter what. So hats off to you, mate, honestly.
Cheers. Thanks, Andy. I appreciate that.
Mate, what's some final words for all of the Aussies out there that are watching this, and they're loving what you do and they're loving your policies? What's the final bit of wisdom for everybody out there before we finish up today?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Look, we do live in a great country. We still have boundless opportunities in this country. Don't give up hope for this country. Don't give up fighting. We are still very lucky. We live in a golden age. We have wonderful technology. We have a very high standard of living, and we owe it to our children, as I've said many times in this interview already, to make sure that they get the opportunities our forefathers gave to us, and we exploit the wealth that we have in this country in a productive and positive manner, so that everyone can share the great wealth of this country and have the choice to live the life that they want to do and reach their potential.
Well said, my friend. Good luck over the next few weeks and months, and again, keep fighting the good fight. Senator Rennick, thank you for being here.
Thanks very much, Andy. It was great to be here.